And let me share my screen. Okay. Yeah, Ishita, if you want to start.
I'm just hitting the recording button as well.
Sure.
So that we have a copy. Okay, welcome. Good morning, everyone. We are here today to learn about, we have our first field session in 2022. And let me just start with a little bit background on Winstep so that we know well what the organization is. So Winstep Forward is a nonprofit organization based in the US whose mission is to promote science and technology between India and the US and has partnered with various government of India scientific agencies to do so. Now, Winstep works with people from STEM career from undergraduate levels to postdoc and faculty in both in India and the US and provides them with opportunity to get experience in research, engaging scientific and technological development, and facilitate education and innovation. Now, Winstep currently is working on building a program which is called Winstep Forward Ekluvya, a virtual university that would be accessible by all. So under this program, we have this field session where we invite accomplished professionals working in different disciplines to share their journey in a talk like we will listen to today. It's not a talk, it's more about discussion through their, so they will talk about their chosen career path and decision they have had to make during this journey, and also share valuable information about how we can follow their path in future. So these sessions will be geared towards high school and undergraduate students who are still trying to figure out a career path for themselves. And today we have a very special guest. It's very special to me because we have Dr. Atashi Mukherjee Bell here, who I know from my grad school in Texas A&M. So she is currently the Senior Director of Global Government Relation in Honeywell International Inc. And she has been through so much in her career path, and I will actually not illustrate more. I admire her career path. I am so thrilled that she is here today to share her journey. And without further delay, let's just welcome her and listen about her incredible journey in this field session. Atashi, welcome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm really excited to be here with you guys, and hopefully I can provide some interesting perspectives on what different paths you can take. I have a background in material science and I have a PhD. Was very fortunate to meet Ishita during that time. I actually got my bachelor's in chemistry from Texas A&M University as well. If you'd asked me in high school what I wanted to do, I don't think I could have come up with an answer for you. I certainly did not start out to want to work in the field of science policy, but throughout my career and my journey, I think I was very fortunate to meet some very interesting and very cultivated people who sort of pushed me in this direction. And I would also say a little bit of this is coincidence. So I would say don't follow my path necessarily, but definitely take inspiration from it as it suits your needs. With that, maybe Ishita, if you have some questions for me, I think that would be really helpful in shaping some of this discussion. I think you're on mute.
Muted, yeah. Ishita, you're muted.
I'm sorry.
It wouldn't be a Zoom call without any technical issues, right? All good. All good. It's only been 3 years into the pandemic at this point.
And mostly I have been on the other side, like listening to the discussion and not like doing this. So yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, I am always interested to know, like, how did you know that you wanted to come to this career path in after grad school? Or did you realize it during the grad school at some point?
Honestly, I wouldn't say I had a very aligned thought process. I worked for a PI, Dr. Abraham Clearfield, and he was one of the rare professors who'd actually worked in industry for a while. And he had this philosophy: if you ever went to his doorstep with a problem, he would always say, "Don't come to me with problems, come to me with solutions." And so very often when we sort of went through the root cause analysis where a lot of the issues that I was facing were stemming from, I'd actually lead to the conclusion that it was either the regulation that was getting in the way, or it was a larger macro scale, big picture issue that was getting in the way. So I would say a lot of that thought process, don't come to me with problems, come to me with solutions, is probably how it drew me into this career field. And I was very fortunate, my first job right out of university, I worked for one of these massive companies that have development programs. They'd rotate you through, different jobs and sort of give you a flavor. I really appreciated that experience because after, doing nothing but being in a lab for 4 to 5 years doing research, it was interesting to be on the ground. So I would say it was more of a requirement that I realized, what do humans need? We need food, we need fuel, we need family, love, sustenance, and then we need governance. So I would say that I sort of realized that through that process that I had a voice, that I liked talking about science, that I liked educating people about the kind of work I do. I also noticed there was a lot of misinformation, and I'm sure you guys have too, where people just don't understand scientists. And the more I looked at the world around me, the more I realized, what was really shocking to me is that scientists don't make rules about the things that govern most of the things we work on, whether it be, in a plant or whether it be regulations about what can end up on a store shelf. So the more I learned about it, the more I realized, why is it that I'm letting lawyers speak for my industry? So I guess that's sort of where it started. It started as an idea, very small, and sort of, took a life of its own. And here I am now working on much more complex issues.
That's a very good point that you mentioned, that we actually do not realize how most of the thing, like the rules of the world, we as a scientist, we always find joy in creation or doing the research and finding reasons for why things happened, but we actually do not pay much attention to what's control us into doing so. So thank you. That's actually a very good point that you mentioned, and what drove you towards this career. Yeah. So, okay, the next obvious question would be when you realized it, how did you prepare for it? It was a very unusual path. So.
Yeah, so I would say my first foray into policy work really started as part of this journey within my company. So I worked for WSF, they're big German chemical manufacturers. And I would say I'm very thankful somebody took a chance on me early in my career. My third rotation out of this sort of 2-year program that I was in, they helped me basically build a program. I wanted to move to Washington, D.C. I knew we had an office there, but I knew there had never been anybody with my background and expertise. So I actually did this very bizarre mapping exercise. I created this job for myself. They'd never had a person like me, and I had to sort of convince them that I would be good at this. So I talked to our assistant general counsel at the time, and I said, I would really be interested in, learning more about policy. And if I'm very bad at it, it's an 8-month rotation. I mean, no harm, no foul. So that's kind of how I personally started. I started by mapping out who exactly could make that happen. And I'd say that's maybe something that folks can take away as well. Look at somebody who has the job that you want and work backwards. So that's kind of what I did, is I looked at who had the job and who had the power to actually make this happen. And I still remember during my interview, it took me 30 individual touch points with people within the company before I was able to reach this person.
Oh,
so
wow.
just be prepared when you're doing this mapping exercise. You will hit a lot of roadblocks and a lot of ends before you reach the right person. And I counted this afterwards because I was kind of curious how long it took me. It doesn't take me 30 touch points anymore to get to the person I need to get to, but that was my first sort of exercise. So that's what I did. I sort of knew where I wanted to be. I knew I wanted to work in DC. I also had a pretty vague idea of what issues I wanted to work on. And then I worked backwards. And then when I had this conversation with this person who could make it happen, I sold it 2 ways. I said, look, I'm free labor. So there's that. If nothing else, you have someone who's boots on the ground for you. So you got to give them a value proposition that would be attractive to them at the same time. And then in reverse, there was also, what makes you think you're going to be any good at this? And I sort of have an ongoing joke. My husband and I, we've been together since early years of grad school. And one of the things I used to say is that my husband's a political science major. He can tell you what my thesis is about. So we sort of have a Freaky Friday, if you will, where he ended up working in the technical field and I wanted to work in policy where, your partner influences you. And I'd say, Steve, my husband can tell you what my thesis is about. I feel like that's a pretty big deal. I think I'd be okay. I think I'm just okay with it. Yeah. So I would say that's how I mapped it out. I sort of looked at the person who had the job and worked backwards. That worked for me. Other people have different methods. You can also go through fellowships. I know for a fact that in the US, you've got AAAS fellowships that you can do. You can apply for a White House fellowship as well. I was already within a corporate program, so that was the path I took. But I know for a fact that there are others who take a much more direct policy path because that's what they want to do.
I guess you already answered part of it, like how hard was it for your transition from like academic field, doing a PhD, and then a non-traditional career where you knew there is no path already laid out for you?
Well, it was hard in some ways and easy in others. It was hard in the sense that you have to get used to rejection and you have to have a thick skin about it. So, a lot of people are going to look at you and say, why? Like you're good at this other thing that you've trained for. You should stick to what you know. And I did. I would say my first job out of college wasn't policy. My first role right out of college was a bit more transitory. I was actually working in a lab. I was, scaling up chemicals that you use in an everyday basis. My second job, I actually did technology acquisition. That was a ton of fun too, actually. I really enjoyed looking at academic research and thinking about how can you commercialize this? What can you do with this? What does this mean for everyday people? How do you make this tangible from an idea? And then it was almost like this very gradual process where I sort of realized, my heart really lies in, again, it's that root cause analysis. Follow the problem and see where it's sort of starting from. And I realized I had a point of view that was perhaps a little bit more assertive than others. And I realized the best way for me to make that impact was going to be through policy work. So I would say in some ways it was easy because it just seemed like a very natural transition. In other ways, it was hard because once I knew what I wanted to do, I had to be prepared to face rejection and be okay with it and have a thick skin about it and be like, okay, this person thinks I'm not going to be great at it. Next one, and you do those 30 meetings. And I think as long as you're okay with that and you're resilient about it, and take that feedback also. Maybe this isn't what's right for you. I guess it's a bit of a measurement exercise where you need to figure out what's going to work for you best. Mm-hmm. So I would say, I'm sort of a keep your head down, very stubborn person. I think that part of my personality helps this process, but easy in some ways, hard in others.
Yeah, I bet, I can imagine. So this is a question, very personal question from me. At any point, did you think you can't do it? Or did you think oh no, this is too late for a transition in the career? Because you have chosen a job in WSF first, which was what you have done in your PhD. So that was an easier transition. Then you shifted gears and did the talent acquisition. Then you actually finally got involved into policy. So at any point in all those years, did you think no, maybe it is too late for a transition? Did you feel like that?
I think once a month, I feel like that sometimes, but that's just me personally, where I sort of take stock of all my life decisions and have an existential crisis. But to be honest, I do think that doubt is part of any journey. It doesn't matter. You could even be the best lab chemist and have been doing it and be very sure this is what you want to do. But then if someone else sort of tells you, oh, you did this wrong, or you could have done this better, it's hard to take that criticism. I would say that I'm a bit of a risk taker. That's part of my personality. it would have been, yes, it would have been significantly easier for me to stick to what I know because I know that I have a job. But I also look at it in some ways as I'm young enough now to make those mistakes. So even if I screw up, I know that I can always go back and fall back to my education. I have a very strong foundation for what I've learned and what I've done. And I've also built a really strong network of people around me. Everybody thinks that you get a job by applying for it on LinkedIn or whatever job board that you're looking for. And then, out of the 50,000 people who may have applied for that position, you get picked. But in reality, you get jobs by building networks around you, by building a community around you. And I have always been very certain that even if this fails, I will have a community around me that will help lift me up and give me that next opportunity. And who's to say by the time I turn 40, I'm not going to be like, okay, I'm done with this. I'm going to, try something completely new. I've played with the idea of going into venture capital because that also is very intriguing for me. So I say, if you're not going to take chances, you're not going to get those rewards. I've had people who have, done a PhD and then ended up doing IP law because that was really interesting for them. So I would say, the only one who's going to hold you back is you. And certainty and wanting to have that comfort can be your enemy sometimes. So part of my personality, I get bored if I keep doing the same thing again and again. And I know that about me. So I would say take stock of what kind of person you are, what excites you, what makes you happy, what kind of work fulfills you, because you are going to be very resentful if you're doing something you don't enjoy and you love, and you're spending, till 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. I very often will start my calls with, my colleagues in China at, 6:30 in the morning. And then again, by the time they're asleep and woken up at 7:30 p.m., I have calls again. So that can be really hard if you don't love what you do. So I would say, I'd rather be happy, doing what I love than be unhappy doing what I may be good at on paper. So that's kind of how I perceive it. But, you have to make that choice for yourself.
Okay, yeah, that I completely agree. So one burning question is like, what are the experience that you gained in PhD that helped you going through this journey, which was like, obviously has needed some core strength in you to fight through all this. So do you think some part of PhD helped you build that character in you?
Absolutely. I don't think I could have done this without having my PhD. If nothing else, PhD taught me how to have a tough hide to all of this. A big part of doing your weekly group meetings and presenting your work for other people to critique, you're basically opening yourself up for other people to take pot shots at your work and you as a person in many ways as well. And so I would say, a PhD teaches you resilience. A PhD teaches you how to really process large sums of information very quickly. A PhD teaches you how to be a critical thinker, which is crucial in any of these roles. And more than anything, and I'll tell you a funny story about this. A PhD teaches you how to focus a discussion on the things that matter and take the rest away. Because part of your job is, when you're doing a PhD, is figuring out what am I going to write my thesis about, right? Like that's a big process. You have this entire universe of issues you could work on, and then you narrow it down and narrow it down and narrow it down, and then you have this hypothesis that you decide you're going to pursue. Policy is very similar in that way. You have this entire universe of issues you could go after, and you have to narrow it down and say, okay, this is what I think I can accomplish. Now, in a PhD, what you do is you do experiments to see if you can prove that hypothesis. In policy, you build stakeholders around you and test that theory, very similar to what you do in a PhD. So I would say a PhD, at least in the sciences for me, was instrumental. I also, the funny story I want to tell you is, within maybe the first 2 months of my coming to DC, I remember sitting in a room full of people who were arguing very passionately, and most of these were lawyers, by the way. So they were arguing very passionately about this one chemical product and how it could potentially affect people around them or communities around them. And I remember looking at this and I was like, doesn't nobody know that this is like an intermediate? Like, it's not even going to end up in this. And then I remember I'm like whispering to somebody and saying, oh, hey, are they not aware? He's like, speak up, tell them. And I was like, oh, okay. I just assumed everybody around me knew. So it sort of made me realize the power of my education at that point. And so I like spoke up and I was like, hey, I happen to be a chemist. Let me educate you about this. And they were like, oh, thank you. And they'd been apparently having that same discussion for several weeks. So I would say, I realized the power of my education and the power of my PhD and the power and value of what I had studied at that point. And it also gave me a little bit more confidence in what value I was bringing to that table, if you will.
Definitely. That's so nice to hear that story. Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay.
You have some of those aha moments. This is one of mine, I would say.
Yeah, I know, like, wait, I am the most knowledgeable in the room.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like, wait,
Yeah.
I can't be the smartest person in this room. That's bizarre.
Okay, we have a question in the chat. So let me just take a moment and address that. Atashi, if you can address that. So Rick asked, policies are tricky because they change with change in administration and thus become a significant barrier to deployment. How do you address that?
So I'll give you a story about this. I passed a sustainability policy in a Republican administration. That was super fun. It was a very challenging project. Policies are not evergreen, much like science is not evergreen. They have to expand with the change in their environment, just like science expands with change in information that you procure. And part of trying to create a policy structure is knowing that you will have to make those updates based on the changes in administration. The way I passed a sustainability-based policy in the midst of the Republican administration is by crafting my message in such a way that for the Republican states, they care more about choice, the freedom of choice of the consumer, the freedom of choice of the business. So if my consumer and my customer wants to choose a sustainability-based product, then that should be a matter of choice. So that's how I sold it, if you will, the idea to a Republican administration. And on the same side, for my Democratic allies, I told them about the sustainability benefits of this product. I told them about what exactly it would entail, what that program sort of meant. So I would say it's important for us to cater the message required to the audience you're approaching. We all have a couple things in common. We all want some things in common. Like I said, the food, the fuel, the sustenance, like these are sort of very common values we all hold. So I think it's important for us to recognize and for us to identify what exactly is that common value within that policy you are proposing for the person sitting across from you. And yes, you will have to change your message and cater your message to the audience sitting across from you. You also have to anticipate, the Kigali Amendment is a really good example. This is how you are phasing down HFCs, which basically power and fuel our air conditioners, our refrigerators. As a world, we had to come together, during the Montreal Protocol and decide, hey, this stuff is, HFCs are polluting our planet. We are creating these ozone holes. We have to come together. Now, not everybody is going to come together at the same time. Not everybody is at the same economic level of really being able to put that into effect. But that's another way in which policy can be catered. You can cater it to the region in question. You can give people room to make those choices for themselves for how they want to administer it, as long as the common goal happens to be, carbon reduction, making sure that we're not creating an ozone layer depletion. So it's more of a find what is common with you and the person sitting across from you, and know that you have to make adjustments as long as that end goal sort of is met. So I would say, look at global policy, see what's been successful in that sense, and don't be rigid. That's one of my biggest sort of takeaways that at least I've learned over time.
Yeah. Absolutely. So Manali here, she is actually very impatient to ask some questions. So I'm going to hand it over to Manali right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Ishita. And thank you, Atashi. If I may call you Atashi.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So I do agree. And I think you mentioned about the importance of having PhD, and then you were talking about how to craft your message, right? Depending on who is sitting next to you. So I think that is also important, right? Like, because PhD also teaches you that is how to craft your scientific work in very different ways. So that's another point, like, I would like to take away from your talk as well, that this is something important to have a PhD in this career, for this career as well. I think we talked a lot about how you came to this career, into this, and then I wanted to explore a bit more about how does it look like for now for you, right? So when you first started, right, that transition process, because even though your subject area is there, you still have a lot of different skill sets that you probably had to learn very quickly in your new job, right? So how was the first 3 to 6 months in your new career? How did that go?
So I will tell you a story about my first week on the job, because I still sort of tell that story sometimes. I remember walking into my policy office, and I wasn't an American back then, by the way. So just keep that in mind. Like, I was still international. I married my husband. I was, had a work permit and everything. So I took maybe the basic, if you will, governance classes, but by no means an expert. So I walked into the office and I looked at my boss back then and I said, I'm a very academic person, as PhDs, we love to read, we want to absorb all this information. I asked him, can you give me a book on how best to be a lobbyist? I would love to learn. I got laughed out of that room. I'm not even joking. It was like one of those bizarre things. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, that's how I study. This is how I learn. I'm an academic at heart. And then he sort of, took me aside and he was like, everything you learn in this job, a lot of it you're going to learn on the ground. Then he took me and my office to a reception that evening. And it was just a very casual, there were a couple of political members in that room and staffers and stuff. And then he gave me an exercise. He said to me, look around you and can you tell which ones are members, which ones are staffers who work for companies, and you can't ask them. I was like, oh my God, I can't ask them. Okay. So I walked around and I observed and I looked, but that was probably one of the most valuable exercises that I learned. I learned that, women who sort of worked in policy for corporate world, they wore certain kinds of shoes or carried certain kinds of bags, versus men who were on Capitol Hill, how they dressed and how they carried themselves and and the members wear these little lapel pins. Those are things if you've never been in the world of policy or politics, you don't know these things. It's not like I had a lesson in any of this stuff. So I still remember sort of learning that on the job. And the story I told you earlier about, sitting in a room full of people within the first few months at a trade association, surrounded by lawyers who were all very much more experienced than I was, arguing themselves to death about something. So I would say those are probably the things that I learned on the job. I've also learned when to keep quiet and listen versus, when it's time for you to speak up. That's something that you modulate and you pick up after the fact. Just because you have an opinion doesn't mean you should give it. That's another thing. I'm sure your moms have told you this. My mom told me this many times. I very rarely heeded that advice in the past, but I did find value of that in my job. So I would say much of this is also about knowing how to influence in the right ways, knowing how to build that around you, community around you. So I would say these are the nonverbal things, or the things that you pick up on the job with maturity and time. And I'm really thankful that I got a lot of those. I'm also really grateful that I was very early in my career, I realized I needed mentors since I hadn't had that formal education and sort of didn't grow up in this world. My biggest advice to you is pick someone who is like you and then pick someone who is not like you at all. What I mean by that is that it's nice to have someone in your corner who sort of walked a mile in your shoes. So for me, it was a woman of color who had been successful in this area, who also had a graduate degree, who had worked for the Clinton administration. And I loved to pick her brain. I would ask her out to coffee all the time. And then I also had my boss, who was this older Jewish gentleman, Republican, and loved, giving me advice, and had a daughter who was about my age. And I liked trying things, running stuff by him. A big part of, my husband's also very unlike me. He was born and raised in the US, grew up in Texas. So he has this very gung-ho sort of personality as well. And whereas, it doesn't seem that way, but I always second guess everything I'm going to say before I say it, or repeat it in my head 5 times. And I'm like, is this the right thing to say? And he's a little bit more like, just say it. What's the worst that's going to happen? So I would say cultivate those people around you who can be those voices in the back of your head, if you will, who can give you good advice, and who can really, create that dialogue, if you will, of that pull and push of what you need to do and what's the right way here. It's important to have people who don't think like you in your corner and in your circle, because they will challenge you and they will help you think beyond your current means.
No, thank you. That was very insightful, and I completely agree. Coming from India myself, I think we do tend to have more like a submissive nature when we first arrive here, and then when you learn and when you see around people here asking all the time questions oh my God, I can ask questions to seniors. Okay, so I think that's a big lesson you learn when you first come here, and also PhD teaches you that. So I'm glad that you brought that up, and that's critical for any kind of position we are in, right? So that's very helpful. How does your current position look like? What do you do on a daily basis right now?
Yeah, so I haven't been at this role for very long. I'm very grateful that I was able to get it. I work for a very strong, independent female leader. I'm the sort of person who, I care about the job, but I care more about who I report to, which probably isn't the best method. This is just one of those little things that I do. Part of my strategy is that good people will develop you to be a good candidate at the end of the day. I've always loved everyone I've worked for. And I follow a person's career. Like I said, my method is always who do I want to be like? Let's work backwards. So I sort of pursue that line of thinking. So I ended up in Honeywell specifically because I wanted to work. So I worked for a European company for 7 years. I loved it. I learned a lot. I was very grateful for the opportunities. They took their first chance on me, but that's a very different culture. I wanted to work for an American company. I also worked for an NGO for 2 years, really enjoyed that in the midst of a pandemic. I was at BIO, which is the world's largest biotech trade association. My first week on the job, I was getting calls from the White House about, how to make sure we had hand sanitizers in the market. That was a very creative and innovative experience. And it taught me about thinking creatively about how to loosen supply chains, how to get things from different people, sort of, bring the right people to the table to make decisions. And then that's sort of how I ended up back into a Fortune 100. I think there's a special marshaling of resources that you need to do in order to get people to do work for you. And it's really tricky in a global organization because there are a lot of captains trying to steer the ship. So I feel like I have a special sort of set of skills that I've developed over time that have helped me understand how big organizations need to do work. Honeywell is just embarking on this big sustainability mission. And because I had spent 7 years in a sustainability-minded organization, because Europe always tends to be a little bit ahead on some of these, I thought this would be a great way for me to see what have I learned, how can I help, and how can I bring them along to this next phase that they're trying to go to. They also have a very interesting portfolio. So part of my strategy is always to work with companies that have a very diverse set of things. I frequency hop, like I like to say, I get bored if I do the same thing again and then again and again. So right now, I'm really, really invested in our performance materials business. So that's basically the stuff I was mentioning about air conditioners or none of this is stuff I've done before, by the way. HFO chemistry is very new to me, but as a scientist, that's one of the things that's so fun and fascinating. We're also working on this product called Spectra that basically is stronger than steel and is flexible and stronger than Kevlar, except it's not a metal plate. So I get to do this cool chemistry. I get to learn about these new areas and products. And I also get to build regulations around an industry that's really trying to do some cutting edge work. So I would say that's kind of what brought me to Honeywell. They have a brilliant portfolio. They're also embarking on this next level for sustainability, and they're American. So that would also round me out a little bit more, if you will, in terms of my background, my expertise, what I bring to the table, and what I'm going to take away from as well. So I would say any job is sort of like matchmaking and dating, and you have to see, what are they giving you for what you're giving them. So they're teaching me things and I'm teaching them things. That's how I look at it.
Nice. Your enthusiasm for your job is really infectious. It's like so nice to see someone, so happy.
I love what I do. I can't not love it. I wouldn't be doing it.
That's really,
I'm a big believer in that. Don't do it if you hate your job.
Yeah, that is something, we are trying to also kind of have this message out that a PhD doesn't always mean like a traditional route. Like there are so many positions that you might love way more than being a bed scientist. So like explore them, figure out what you really like, and kind of, go in that direction. So I'm really happy that you are like kind of helping us, get that message out. So thank you for that.
And just because I'm not in science, just because I'm not doing bench chemistry right now doesn't mean I don't absorb and read papers. I work with academics all the time. In fact, I work in collaboratories if there are research areas where, we have members who question what is the efficacy of this chemical. Very often we get third-party certified certifiers. So essentially you work with universities to really back up what you're thinking and say, hey, can you explore this? So, you work with academics all the time. So just because you're out of the lab doesn't mean you're out of science.
That makes sense.
Actually, I can interrupt. I totally I appreciate that you brought it up, because people sometimes think that if you leave your main career path, you are never going to come back to it. That's not actually true. You always will carry the information, the training you have earned in the PhD all your life, whichever job actually you go to. I believe that, and I see that, and then you brought it up today, and then I'm like, I appreciate that you brought it up. Thank you. That's a very good point.
No, and I would say I've worked in policy, I've done lobbying, but then I also went back to regulatory, which is where you're a lot more involved in the day-to-day designing of the actual scientific experiments, knowing how to submit a dossier for a product to get accepted, where you're actually looking at data and you're looking at science every day. So I have traveled back and forth between those two. What is my dream job at the end of the day is really like a blend of the two, which is what I am right now. But I have had to do both individually, understand the politics and the policies, but then also do the regulatory work and submission. So I honestly think that's the biggest difference between being a lawyer, and I love my lawyer friends. I'm so grateful for them and their wisdom. But I do think that we have a unique skill set that we bring to the table. I've learned a lot of the legal stuff just on the job. And that's why I loved working for the general counsel for my last company, because he taught me a lot of that on the fly. But it's a lot harder to go from law to going to a very hard science background. So I would say you can do both. There is no one saying you can't, but the transition, I would say, is a lot easier if there is that willingness to do so.
Okay. I think just based on what you've been telling us about Honeywell, we have an audience question about Honeywell's sustainability policy and how does it create value for its customer?
So we have 5 specific sectors that we work in. Our largest one is the aerospace division, but one of the coolest projects, and I'll tell you about one of the projects because I think a story is a little bit easier than me giving you corporate sustainability goals of we want to be carbon neutral by so and so year. Let me tell you a story about a project that's pretty inspiring. We actually acquired this. This guy basically had something he developed in his lab. So it was actually a specific kind of camera that helps to monitor methane emissions. He made a bench scale version of this. It was a pilot version of this. Then he had this idea that what if I deploy it within larger, I think we have, okay. What if we deploy this within, larger LNG terminals? One of the biggest problems we have is that we have a lot of methane emissions that come from pre-existing natural gas pipelines and stuff. And it's really hard. EPA actually tries to measure it and monitor it, but they don't do a very good job right now. They look at it like once a month or twice a month, perhaps. There's no way to continuously monitor it. So this guy basically had this idea in his lab, and he came up with this type of camera that can actually look at methane emissions. And then Honeywell bought this technology, brought him on as the CTO of this, and then basically figured out, how do we pilot this? How do we deploy this? How do we make this, a mass scale this idea? I loved that because it sort of combines my two passions, right? One is I love technology acquisition. I did that for part of my life. So, we brought that on. But then now that you have this technology, they figured out how to pilot it, mass scale it, and now they're basically trying to sell it to like the Exxons of the world who are trying to get their corporate sustainability goals met. So it's almost like the Honeywell sustainability policy or the mantra is, how do we help you achieve yours? Right? Because again, you got to look at what value you're bringing to the person across from you. If I'm building technologies that are not solving specific niche needs that are not being addressed, then what's the point? You can make a bio-based chemical, but if the economics of it don't agree, at the end of the day, that's kind of pointless. So here was a niche in an environment where you wanted to address the sustainability of, and it's called the rebellion business. Just, for folks, if you want to Google it and look it up, there's some really cool YouTube videos of this as well. And they're basically trying to deploy it all over the world. It's going to help you continuously monitor methane. You're going to prevent fires. You're going to prevent, because large pockets of methane ending up over an area can cause big disasters. We've seen them in Texas, Louisiana. We've seen a lot of unfortunate events happen. So imagine if this was actually required by regulation now. So this is where I bring you the policy aspect of it. The technology exists. We found somebody who could do this very cool thing. We put the money behind it by putting a giant company like Honeywell who would basically take this to the next level. And now comes the policy aspect. How do you make sure that you deploy this in all the right areas and ensure that everybody gets to basically meet their carbon reduction goals? Methane has a 4 times higher GWP, global warming potential, than carbon dioxide. So if you think about it, if I'm able to prevent methane emissions from X number of plants, you do the math, and this is where your technical chops come in. That's how you make your policy case. That's how you think through, how much money am I saving for these companies? How much value am I providing for the environment around me? And how does that make sense from a company perspective? So that's just one example of sort of like the cool sustainability stuff that Honeywell is working on that I'm going to be a big part of.
Right. That's really interesting, and I hope Eric, that answers your question as well. And anyone else, if you have any questions, feel free to post in the chat box. We do have another like 10 minutes or so. So we did have like a separate kind of going into a separate direction. Wanted to ask a little bit about, like what advice you would have for aspiring, young generation trying to get into this area. I mean, thinking of science policy, regulatory affairs. So something maybe like you wanted to do, which you couldn't do, that they should definitely do while they are coming into this area.
So I haven't worked for an international body yet. And what I mean by that is it would be really cool to work for the UN, for example, or sort of, take yourself out of the country perspective. I've done global work. I've done individual country by country work. I've also done, state work. I have yet to do international work though. And I think it would be really cool. And not to say I wouldn't do it in the future, but I think that would be a really cool thing to do. Now, in terms of what advice I would give you guys, be a little bit more organized than me. I would love to say I had this grand plan or strategy on how I wanted to get there. I've always been a short-term goals kind of person. Like I'm always looking like the next 3 years. That's kind of how I sort of build my career. So I'm not like 10 years from now, I want to be CEO of blah, blah, blah. And I really don't think that way. I have a friend, and you should Google her. Her name's Tanvi. I actually went to high school with her, and she started her own policy firm. Much like me, she had a science-based background. I think she actually did her bachelor's in engineering, but she actually went to school for policy work in grad school. She actually did grad school for that. So I would say, if I wanted to do this, I probably should have had a better sort of plan there. I learned a lot of things on the job. I could have probably stopped at a master's and then, gotten a policy-based background. So I don't have that street cred, if you will, on some of these areas. So I would say, get that street cred if this is what you want to do with your life. I've always sort of been like, maybe I want to do this other thing. And I've never committed wholly to one area or the other. But if you know for a fact that this is your passion, this is what you want to do, you're not going to move, don't do something just to check a box. The PhD shouldn't be like, I love what I did my thesis on, to be very clear. I'm very glad I did it. I tend to be passionate about everything I pick up because I wouldn't pick it up otherwise. But that's also part of, my personality and strategy. It doesn't have to be yours. So I would say learn from my mistakes, be a little bit more focused in that area. I sort of pinged everywhere. And I also have this sense of urgency about me. So I sort of, try to move very quickly, be a little bit more patient. That's something that I have learned over time, that policy takes exercise and work. And, I think Eric brought up the question before. It's very disappointing when the administration changes and they're trying to flip everything you just spent like months and years building. So don't get disappointed. Just know that that's going to happen. It's part of the process. Understand that that's part of the flow that you have to live with, and try to build policies that are a little bit more evergreen with that in mind, if that's what you want to do. So yeah, I would say be patient, build your community around you, have a pretty good sort of thought process of where you want to end up. And if short-term goal building works for you, great, because that's what works for me. But if you are a long-term planner, make that plan, have that vision board, build those steps.
Just like a quick follow-up, because you did mention this quite a few times about understanding the nitty-gritties of politics and who are kind of the current players and everything. So do you think while they are learning things for this career, is that important to know more about politics and what's going on currently?
Yes, and here's why. I've always been at a bit of a disadvantage on what you would call the daily. Okay, I'll give you a funny story. Before I used to go for some of these events, I would actually look up who won what sports games, because I wanted to have something to talk about. And I was so unfamiliar with US-based sports, and I felt stupid at the time. So
we got that advice from all the workshops that happen in Texas A&M. They would say the first thing that you need to know who won the baseball game.
You have to know who won the baseball game or football game or have a team. And I'm sort of thankful, to my husband for that, because he's like my cheat sheet, if you will. What should I care about? But the baseball. And I'm trying to draw a parallel here between everyday sports, but also the politics. If you don't understand the history of why certain people came to the conclusions they came to, it's very hard to move them. So the history matters, because you can be blue in the face talking logic, but you have to understand where that position is coming from. If there's a dogmatic opinion, somebody pissed them off, maybe your company did a bad thing 100 years ago and you weren't part of it. You have to know, because otherwise you're at a disadvantage, right? Because they have more information than you do, and you're basically talking to a wall. So know your position, know the person sitting across from you. Sun Tzu, know thy enemy, right? So it's just it just puts you, it also shows that you care and you're interested, and you can acknowledge where you may have different opinions. So I would say, yes, follow the politics. You don't have to be obsessive about it. Even if I start my mornings with a flash briefing. I end my mornings with a flash briefing. I also just consume a lot of news and literature just because the kind of person I am. But make that part of your lifestyle choice for sure.
Okay. That's very useful. Thank you so much, Atashi. I think this was like really great. Like you answered all our questions. We covered a lot of area. I do see that we have Navida with us. She's the Executive Director of Winstep. So Navida, in the last 5 minutes, if you have any comments or questions for Atashi.
Hi, Atashi. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry I was running late, but actually, you know, what you're talking about is so interesting. Science policy is just, you're kind of at that border between where you could accomplish so much and be so frustrated because you feel like you're not accomplishing very much. What's the most frustrating part about your work? What would you say?
That logic has nothing to do with it.
Right.
I hate to say it, but it's the fact is that I can be the smartest person in a room or feel like I'm the smartest person in a room, and it has nothing to do with the policy outcome very often. Because if the stakeholders and the community I build around you doesn't feel the same way, it's kind of inconsequential. There's a reason why they don't, you know, scientists very often don't run for office. There's a very interesting book that I would recommend folks read if you have the time. It's called I'm Not a Scientist, but ... And the preface of the book really is that very often you sit at congressional hearings and policy hearings, and very often someone will say, I'm not a scientist, but, and they'll have this massive opinion that is completely not based in reality. And the truth is that that's the world you are working with. Would I love to reset that system and change it? No. The most frustrating thing I think about my job is you're going to have to be okay with that, and you're still going to have to push forward, and you're going to have to find creative ways of convincing people to the science. The science will not lead it. The science will lead you, but the science will not lead it.
Exactly. And I'm sorry, my thing turned off. I just have to find my charger. So my yesterday, actually, I was at a public hearing. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was holding a public hearing for a pipeline that the fossil fuel companies want fast-tracked.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so they don't have to get permissions that they need at every site that they need to get them from. They just want like a general law laid out that, yeah, we can do this across any site we want to without consulting the local population.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so we were all there. Most of us were against this policy and we were speaking against it, but the pipeline workers were also there.
Mm-hmm.
And they were giving their point of view, which, you know, of course, to us, it sounded like a spiel directly from the mouth of the fossil fuel companies. But it was so fascinating, actually, hearing their point of view. And ultimately, it kind of sounded like they were like, oh, yeah, we really want to help the environment. That's why we work so hard to make these pipelines foolproof and everything. And we care about the environment, which is why we do such a good job on them. And then the other side was like, wait a minute, there are leaks all the time. What are you talking about? You care about the environment. So I don't know.
Maybe I should sell them some of that Honeywell rebellion technology that I just talked about.
Okay.
Where we monitor leaks continuously. So we talked about that before you came in.
Yeah, and you know what you were just talking about, the guy who built the methane reader, right, detector. It's an amazing technology, and it's something that these companies could really use, but will they implement it? Because what if it gives readings they don't want advertised? You know, what if
they will implement it if it is mandated? My job is to help get it mandated.
Okay, that's key.
So you have to think about it that way. It's like nothing actually ever happens willingly. You kind of have to bring people to the table, and you have to figure out. I mean, none of this stuff is cheap either. So if you're a mom and pop, you know, there are many different versions of this. There's the big players. It's always easier for them to implement some of this.
Yeah.
It's the smaller ones. I mean, the SEC right now has come up with a big rule where companies will have to report as part of their financial statement in their 10K every year. Basically, investors will have to know, how are you managing your emissions? How exactly are you reporting your emissions? that helps me. I'm not going to lie, like putting it straightforward. So I would say you have the right environment right now. What you need is allies to help you implement some of these strategies. We all need gas right now. That's a fact. Right. We're not going to go back to bicycles. It's not happening. Right. We're also not going to swap over to green energy very quickly. We also have a massive crisis in Ukraine right now that is really, untenable and creating this massive situation. So how do you go from what you want, but work with the right companies to sort of get you to that same end goal, if you will?
Exactly.
So I would say that's a policy choice. You have more big players behind you than you realize.
That's true.
And it's more a question of making sure you're finding the right partners. Part of my strategy, part of my job is also to build that community with NGOs around me, because maybe my predecessors didn't do this. That's kind of what I was talking about. Is I'm working with American companies and trying to bring them to that sustainability forefront. And it takes time and it takes patience and it takes a lot of pushing and a lot of failure before you get to that. But just know that we have common goals at the end of the day.
Exactly. And so, all right, how are things going to change, do you think, if Trump does win the election in a few years and you're still at this position? How do you think things are going to change? Like, is it mostly theatrics for the public, or does it actually affect policy at a deeper level?
It always impacts policy at a different level. The first time I sort of cried to my best friend and I was like, I don't know if I can keep doing this. And one of the things she told me is like, now more than ever, they need people like you and voices like yours. So I would say the same thing to you. So what? We have a very robust political system in this country. I love it. I love that you can disagree with anybody and you can't go to jail for it. I love that we can all have opinions. I love that they can be very, very contradictory. And yes, some of it is political theater and kabuki, if you will, but that's part of the process. We also have, it's like living in modern day Rome. I mean, how fortunate are we that we get to have this kind of elevated discourse? Some of it's not so elevated, but there are a lot of elevated minds around us. It's good to have people who challenge you. You find creative ways of getting around that. Yeah. So now more than ever, I would say, who cares who's in the office? That's why we have checks and balances. We have a wonderful system that we work with, whether it's through political courts or whether it's through legislative and discourse. So just keep that in mind. Never lose hope in that. I'm the ever optimist. I have my own gray areas that I have beliefs in, and I think that's important to keep in mind that you're not going to win them all, but at the same time, don't stop trying to change, minds, hearts and minds. And that's the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry to interrupt, Navida. I think Atashi has a very hard stop at 8.
Okay. Right.
So I know I could enjoy this discussion and talking to you, Atashi, for another few hours probably. I have I have so many questions I want to discuss with you, get your opinion and everything. But I know that you have a hard stop at 11. So I'm sorry, but okay, we have.
I would be happy to continue this at another time. You guys have my information. Like I said, build that community around you. That's my biggest takeaway. And if you ever need advice or you feel like you just need to punch something, I'm happy to go grab a drink and punch something. So that's what you need to do.
Yeah. We will schedule whenever you have some time, and then we continue this discussion. This is amazing. This has been amazing. It made my Friday morning, so I hope it did for everyone. So thank you so much, Atashi, for coming here today, and I hope we will talk soon.
Yeah. Thank you so much
for having me. I appreciate it. Bye, guys.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Bye.